Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to a discussion of the science in Star Trek. Now, this is in part almost a history of science talk, but it banks on the fact that the two versions of Star Trek that I'm going to talk about today, the Next Generation and the original series, are separated by about 25 Earth years. But both shows occasionally had similar plot lines or similar plot devices that enable us to talk about the changes in science that went on in those 25 Earth years. And other changes went on as well. Notice that in the subtitle, I say where no one has gone before. That was what the Next Generation said. In the original series, it was where no man has gone before. And I would suggest that also illustrates a change in what went on socially in the country during those intervening 25 years. Through the crews of the two ships, and I will talk exclusively about the original series and the Next Generation, with a few exceptions in this talk. Just to introduce you to the crews, in the original series, starting on the right-hand side, we have Mr. Spock, who is the only alien on board the Enterprise in a command position. He's half Vulcan, half half human, and he is very much the voice of logic and reason. We then have, well, yeah, it's a different, if it's a different outfit, but it's the same people. Next to him is Captain Kirk, then Leonard McCoy, who is the chief medical officer. Next to him is Lieutenant Chekhov, Ensign Chekhov. Chekhov is a Russian. Remember, in the 60s, we were in a Cold War with Russia. Chekhov was the face of the enemy, yet Roddenberry put him on the bridge. Above Mr. Chekhov is Zulu. Zulu, again, valued member of the bridge crew. He was Asian. We were in a hot war with Vietnam. Again, he was the face of the enemy, yet the optimism of Roddenberry put him on the bridge. Next to him is Lieutenant Uhuru, a black woman. 66 was the hotbed for not only women's rights, but of course civil rights. And the fact that Roddenberry, as he put it, put a little color on the bridge is very emblematic, again, of the optimism of Star Trek. And then finally, we have Mr. Scott, who's the chief of engineering. We go across to the Next Generation. We're 25 Earth years in the future, but almost 100 fictional years in the future in the Star Trek universe. We have Mr. Oh, shoot. I just lost my train of thought. We have our navigator, who is Geordie LaForge, who is blind. Rather interesting that a spacecraft has a blind navigator. The device he wears across his eyes enables him to see. Next to him, we have Mr. Data. Data is an android. He's a machine. And we'll talk a little bit about the contrast between Data and Mr. Spock. Data is also a voice of logic, but he's a very different voice than Spock was. Next to him, we have Commander Worf. Worf is a Klingon. He's an alien. He's not an Earthling. And I will point out again, this is part of Roddenberry's optimism. In the original series, the Klingons were our enemies. In this series, that has changed, and the Klingons are now our allies, and Worf is a valued member of the bridge. Next to him, we have Commander Riker, second in command. Next to him, Beverly Crusher, chief medical officer. Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the Enterprise. And Diana Troy, another alien. She's a Betazoid. She's a voice of conscience and a voice of intuition for Picard, especially in political negotiations. So those are fundamentally the crew members we're going to be talking about. Oops. Didn't want to jump up. Let's go get right into it. The very first show I want to talk about involves problems that are still unsolved today, mainly viral infections. The show in the original series was called The Naked Time. The crew is ordered to pick up the staff at a remote outpost, and the outpost is observing large changes in gravitational shifts in their surroundings. When the Enterprise gets to the outpost, they find everyone is dead. I'm making no comment about Mr. Spock's spacesuit here, but at any rate, the crew that goes down to see what's going on notices the following. Mr. Scott says The cause of this is unknown. It's like nothing we've dealt with before, finding this entire crew of people dead. Um, Life support has been turned off, and people are doing strange things. There's a man in a shower clearly showering, but he's fully clothed. McCoy, the chief medical officer, says the cause is not drugs or intoxication. Bioanalysis proved that conclusively. But remember when I said Spock was the voice of reason? Spock says instruments register only those things they are designed to register. Space is full of infinite unknowns. Nice cautionary tale and very typical of Spock. Well, that goes on in the Enterprise. When the crew that was down on the planet comes back up, all of a sudden, all the crew members start to begin behaving as if they're intoxicated. Their inhibitions are released. They're irrational. They're doing crazy things they've never done before. The picture is an example of that. Sulu becomes this swashbuckling, sword-carrying person who's looking for battles all over the place. McCoy, the doctor, finally discovers the cause. He says, we've isolated it. Start preparing serum. It's water. We'll go into later about what that actually means. But somehow on this planet, water has changed into a complex chain of molecules. That's how we missed it. This is McCoy talking. It passes from man to man in perspiration. Once in the bloodstream, it acts like alcohol, depresses center of judgment and of self-control. McCoy, as the physician, prepares a serum to counter the virus. Everyone is cured. The virus is overcome, and they'll warp off to their next generation. The next to the next destination. The next generation has an extremely similar show in the first season called The Naked Now. They get a distress call from the crew of the Tsiolkovsky. The Tsiolkovsky is a ship that's observing the collapse of a star, so gravitational events again. When they get to the Tsiolkovsky, everybody's dead. The boarding party reports the following. Data says, indications of what humans would call a wild party. Picard says, give me a theory, Doctor. Madness, mass hysteria, delusion. Crusher just says, any or all, Captain. She doesn't have a clue. She's a very good physician, but she's mystified by all this. The crew on the Enterprise, after the boarding party returns, begins to experience exactly the same symptoms the crew in the original series experienced: apparent intoxication, release of inhibitions, irrational behavior. They're a lot funnier than the crew in the original series, but it's still the same story. Counselor Troy, who's an empath, dials into someone and says, all I sense from him is confusion. If I didn't know better, I'd say he was drunk. Crusher says, our tests would have shown that. Also, all signs of drugs, hallucination, or other contaminants. She needs Spock's voice in her ear saying, instruments detect only those things that are designed to detect. But at any rate, that's the doctor's very accurate assessment. Commander Riker actually remembers a historical account of a very similar event, aka what happened in the original series. Data finds the story in the computer files, and they notice that the same thing is going on, huge shifts in gravity. So they now realize that what they have to look for, and once again, the same cause is revealed. Huge chains of water are forming. And these chains of water, in quotes, acquire carbon from the body, don't know how that happens, and hold that thought, Gus, I'll be there in a second, and act on the brain like alcohol. They find McCoy's original formula for the antiviral agent, but it doesn't work. The virus has mutated. So Crusher isolates the virus again. It has now changed. She preps a new antiviral remedy, and the Enterprise crew and staff is restored to sobriety and sanity and health, and they get out of the place before the star that the Tsiolkovsky was observing explodes. Okay? Science of the times. In both shows, the plot device is the same, a viral infection. Remember polywater, as Gus just said? It was called anomalous water. Polywater wasn't identified as such until the 70s. And the discussions about polywater were terrific. Early in the 70s, by the way, it was alleged to be found in capillary tubes and was this form of polymeric water. People were on two camps. They said, oh, if polywater is released into the world, all water would turn into polywater and life would be destroyed as we know it. Or The other camps were saying, hey, it could be useful. It could be a great antifreeze. We could use it as a desalination tool. So both camps got together and really decided that the whole polywater thing was baloney and it didn't exist and it was a contamination in the samples that people were looking at. So, but this is a case where really life, yes, it did, Sis, it was a big hoax, but life imitates art in The Naked Time. And the theory that involved polywater was totally debunked by the time The Naked Now comes around. Now, in point of fact, viral mutations were known both in the 60s and in the 80s, and we clearly still face that problem today. And again, this gets at the one of the features of Star Trek. It's very positive. You know, we're 3 centuries, 4 centuries out from where we are now, and we haven't lost yet. Viruses still exist, but we can still counter them, and we still exist as humans. Regarding alcohol's effects, none of the stories transcend the common folk wisdom about alcohol and behavior. But again, it gets at the positive features of Star Trek. Now, here's a little more serious one. It's on chemistry and aging. In the original series, the show was called The Deadly Years. The away team, which consists of, again, reading right to left, Dr. McCoy, Commander Scott, Lieutenant Chekhov, Captain Kirk, on the very far left, Mr. Spock, and the shortest person down there is Lieutenant Galloway. Those of you who know the story, guess who dies? Be that as it may. What happens is they go down, Chekhov goes into this room and he comes out screaming. He's terrified. He says they're just dead bodies in there. And he's shaking like a leaf. He's sweating. Cook gets in touch with the commander of the station, who responds to his query. The guy is only 29 years old, and his second in command is younger still. But look at what they look like. They're extremely old. They've aged tremendously. So Gamma Hydra 4, it turns out, was exposed to radiation from a comet. And the folks on the Enterprise know that. But what's happening? Why are these people aging? But it's not everybody who was on the away team who is aging. Chekhov is spared this. He's still his normal age. Nothing is happening to Chekhov. Everybody else is aging. There's McCoy. There's Kirk. You can see how old they are. There's poor Lieutenant Galway. She's died. McCoy says, I don't know what's causing it, virus, bacteria, or evil spirits, but I'm going to find out. Kirk gestures toward Chekhov, and he says, why hasn't he aged? Is it his youth, his blood type, his heritage, his glands, his genes? McCoy just replies, his genes, grumble, grumble, grumble. He doesn't want to hear anything about that. Spock, however, identifies the cause. It's apparently whatever the radiation was from the comet, it was what accelerated the aging unto death of the people on the station. And it's the same thing that is now affecting the away crew on the Enterprise. They have on board at this time a visiting endocrinologist named Dr. Wallace. She's the person in the far left and the bottom photo. And she describes what they're trying, because McCoy has asked her to help him out. She says, to allay this aging, we've tried various combinations of carbohydrate compounds to slow down the degeneration of plant life. We know the problem. We know the progress of the affliction. Once we find the proper line of research, it's only logical we find a solution. She's very positive about this. Recalling Chekhov's behavior on the planet, Kirk goes back to his leitmotif, why hasn't he aged? And then he says, wait a second. Chekhov was scared. He was scared to death down there. McCoy says he's very aged now, so he said, right, scared, heart beats faster, breath gets short, cold sweats, adrenaline flows. Hold on, ancient history, just after the atomic age, used for radiation sickness. Adrenaline, yes, fear will sometimes keep you alive. Oops, didn't mean to do that quite yet. Bottom line is, Dr. Wallace, the guest, says, but Dr. McCoy, adrenaline has been replaced for the past 100 years by this synthetic compound that takes care of radiation sickness. But we'll try it. So they whip up a batch of adrenaline. They give it to all the crew members. And sure enough, not only is their aging stopped it's reversed and everybody goes back to normal and they go off to their next adventure. On the next generation, the show is called Unnatural Selection, and it has a similar experience. The Enterprise responds to a distress call from the USS Lantry. By the time they get there, everybody on board is dead. Their last port of call was Darwin Station. The upper photograph shows the commander of the Lantry in his commander's chair. The man's on record as being only 35 years old, and yet he's extremely old and he's died on the job. The Enterprise goes to Darwin Station to find out what's going on, and where they contact the scientist in charge, whose name is Dr. Kingsley. Dr. Kingsley is the person pictured in the lower left-hand photo. Picard says hello to her and starts asking questions, as does the physician of record on this trip, Dr. Pulaski. Catherine Pulaski is just recently sent to the Enterprise to stand in for Dr. Crusher, who's away at a scientific meeting. So she begins asking Dr. Kingsley some questions, and Dr. Kingsley says, "With whom am I speaking?" And Picard introduces Catherine Pulaski. Dr. Kingsley says, "Catherine Pulaski, the author of Linear Models of Viral Propagation?" Pulaski says, "That was a long time ago." Kingsley says, "But it's still the standard. I can't think of anything I'd rather be dealing with." And then she describes what's going on. "We're experiencing the rapid onset of geriatric phenomenon. Our research here is limited to human genetics. I can assure you we're not dealing with something that has gotten away from us, but our immediate concern are the children. They present years of advanced genetic research." Kingsley requests that the children that she mentions be evacuated. Picard absolutely refuses because he needs proof that the children are indeed harmless. So a lot of discussion goes on board the Enterprise, and they decide they can beam up one child encased in a material called styrolite so that Pulaski can examine him. Now, this is the child, big boy. He's encased in styrolite, so nothing from him gets out and nothing from the environment in the Enterprise gets into him. Pulaski examines him and says, his immune system is so advanced it may not be possible for him to contract disease. She wants to take him out of the styrolite and examine him. Picard still says no. He's very concerned about the children being a vector and that they really don't know. So in discussions, Picard agrees that Data, who's immune from human pathogens because he's an android, can take Pulaski and this child out into space in a shuttlecraft just off the side of the Enterprise and continue the examination and release him from styrolite. Pulaski does that. Again, this is the child. Whew. And all of a sudden she looks at him and says, "Why, yes, I hear you perfectly. Yes, I understand." And Data looks at her incredulous and says, I don't hear a thing. What's going on?" And she says, "He's telepathic. He's communicating directly to me via telepathy." But then as soon as that happens, Pulaski screams, and she immediately experiences arthritic inflammation in her elbow. And she can tell as she scans herself that it's spreading rather rapidly. Again, arthritic inflammation, one of the hallmarks of aging. She realized the children are the carriers of the malady. They can't go back to the Enterprise, so they go down to Darwin Station. Well, they couldn't examine the children. That was the problem, and that's why it proceeded the way it did. Kingsley is still incredulous. She says, "I don't see how you could have been infected by the children. They were designed to resist disease. Their immune system was our masterpiece. We gave the children an aggressive immunity. Their immune systems don't wait for a disease to attack the body. It would seek out airborne virus and destroy it. The antibody would adapt itself to alter the genetic code of the virus." But they find out that a crew member on the Lantry had the Thelusian flu. Data does an analysis, in quotes, at the molecular genetic level of the interaction. He pulls up pictures on the screen of the DNA of the people prior to their exposure, then once they start aging, and he observes that the Lantry was not the source of the disease, but it was the trigger, exposing the children to the Thelusian flu. Their active immune system attacked the virus, and kept going. The antibody created an unexpected side effect. It altered the genetic makeup of normal humans. In other words, this antibody was so aggressive it not only went out and destroyed the antibody before it could get to the children, it went out and destroyed the carrier of the antibody, namely the human beings. So everybody on the Tsiolkovsky got it, and now everybody at Darwin Station has it. And Pulaski comments, and since our DNA is self-replicating, Data says the process is irreversible. So he sounded the death knell for everybody. Now, this is what Pulaski thinks is her final log entry. Judging what happened on the land tree, anyone is a carrier once they are afflicted. The children do not carry the disease, they are its cause. Their advanced immune system has created an antibody that changes normal DNA. The altered genes are the ones that control aging. Just as changes in evolution are known to be caused by changes in the environment, we also know the process works in reverse. An attempt to control human evolution has resulted in a new species that is lethal to its predecessor. The children will be condemned to live out their lives in isolation. The quarantine of Darwin Station must be maintained forever. And in the upper picture, that is now Pulaski. She has aged very, very rapidly. On the Enterprise, they discuss some transporter magic that they think they can do to, first and foremost, restore Pulaski, but then also help the people on Darwin Station who are afflicted. They need a sample of Pulaski's DNA because they want to do some transporter magic to restore her to what she was prior to her exposure. Riker, they decide they need a sample of Pulaski's DNA, but they don't have one because she's just new to the Enterprise, her medical records haven't caught up, and she has refused to use the transporter because she hates it. So they decide they have to get a sample of her DNA. So Riker says, we need a cell, a single cell. Let's check her quarters. So she goes, Riker and Data go to Pulaski's quarters. Data finds a hairbrush. He pulls out a hair and he says, look, it has a follicle, live cells. So they give Miles O'Brien, who runs the transporter, the live cells. O'Brien makes a molecular matrix that he can use to filter Pulaski through when she's transported back to the Enterprise. And if it works, it will filter out the newly reformed DNA that's causing the incredibly rapid aging and restore her normal DNA. So they do this, and although it's never been done before, it works. Pulaski comes back to the Enterprise. She's restored to her former self. They realize they can do this now for all the people at the Darwin Station, and everything will be fine. And you're right, Sis, the transporter has featured frequently in this as a that's why I call it transporter magic. We've got to cut them a little latitude. Remember, this is more about entertainment than it is about science. And if they have anything we can talk about, it's really pretty good. Here's Pulaski's benediction on the whole thing. Scientists believe that no experiment is a failure, that even a mistake advances the evolution of understanding. But all achievement has a price. For one brief glimpse of the mysterious blueprint of human evolution, the men and women of the USS Lantry paid with their lives. Their sacrifice is thus noted in this scientist's log. Absolutely right. A failed experiment is still data. And that's exactly what she's expressing there. So, what's the science of the times? Remember, the deadly years was back in the 60s. The next generation was in the late 80s. The plot device in the deadly years was radiation. Well, at that point, there was a very popular hypothesis called the free radical hypothesis of aging that was discussed at great length, first published in Journal of Gerontology in 1956, so 10 years before the show. And gerontological changes were correlated with the destruction of cellular material that was associated with radiation exposure. All of the things that happen to biological things from the molecular level all the way up to the tissue level could be produced by reactions involving either free radicals or radiation. It also reflects a fear in the general public. Remember, this was less than 20 years after Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The horrors of radiation from the atomic bomb were still with us. If you were a kid in the 50s in elementary school, you probably had drills where in the event of a nuclear bomb, you would go away from the windows and hide under your desks in an effort to protect you from radiation. There was another theory that was popular that comes up in this too. When Lieutenant Galloway dies, remember she was the unknown person on the away team. McCoy says she's dead. Her metabolism caused her to age more rapidly than the rest of us. That was the metabolic rate of living theory. In other words, the faster you live, the faster you die, which had been popular since 1907. So that was a theory that McCoy was espousing in terms of explaining what was going on with Galloway. Now, nobody was seriously working on reversing agent, but people were working on radiation protective agents. And there were a whole suite of materials which were free radical scavengers, which were shown to, if anything, lengthen the lifespan of mice. You know, and they could they could minimize the effects of radiation when given in advance of an exposure. Most of them were too toxic for use as radiation protectives in humans. Now, in terms of treatment of individuals suffering whole body radiation injury, this is a clinical problem of concern. Now, remember, this is 1966. There's absolutely no mention of McCoy's choice to use adrenaline as either a radiation protective or a treatment. But glandular extracts and plant products were being studied um, for a variety of ailments, in addition to exposure, both in fact and in fiction. There was a book by Dorothy L. Sayers and a story by Arthur Conan Doyle called The Incredible Creeping Man, both of which dealt with either plant extracts or hormonal extracts, glandular extracts for a variety of maladies. Um, Dr. Wallace suggested experiments using carbohydrates to slow down the generation in plants could be looked at. And it was known in the 60s that glucose alters proteins. It's called the Maillard reaction, but that tends to contribute to degradation, not retard it. So, uh, bottom line is they had some good ideas, but it's a fanciful story. But that's the science that was known in the 60s. Let's take a look at what was going on by the time we get to the late 80s. The plot device is very different. They're dealing with DNA, genes, genetic engineering. That great scientific publication Newsweek magazine had a big article in 1990 subtitled All Roads Lead to the Gene. It was all about aging. So Star Trek is spot on in their use of anything dealing with genes as a means to alter the aging profile of an individual. There was a gene in 1988 identified in nematodes that could be manipulated in a way that extended the lifetime of the worms by 70%. That's pretty amazing. The complex process of aging in the 80s and in the 90s was firmly rooted in the genetic makeup of an individual. And it was known that one could manipulate genes to extend life in certain organisms. We have to give them literary license to say perhaps genes could be manipulated to shorten life as well. As an aside, hooray to Data for using hair with a follicle to provide live cells. He didn't just go with a sample of hair. And then sociologically, take a look at Dr. Wallace's comment. We can do this. It's only logical we find a solution. Versus Pulaski's much more circumspect statement, all achievement has a price. What's the benediction? Not bad on both counts in terms of the science of the eras. And when you take a look at the difference between the 60s and the 80s and 90s, we learned a lot about aging. And the concept of the ideas about delaying it and stopping it and reversing it have been around for centuries. So there's nothing new literarily. But the science that was used in both shows was accepted science of the time. And sure, they extended some things. They took literary reference. I saw the side discussions about how they portrayed aging. But, that was an important part of this, and the fears of the general public were treated as well. A lot of people fear this day, the results of genetic engineering, as well as still the effects of radiation. Now, I have to take a segue here and come up to modern times, and this is a special for the folks who are involved in the moon base. As I was putting this together, Science, which is the publication of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, very, very prestigious journal, had an update, what they called an update from space in their issue just 2 weeks ago, where they quote NASA as saying the following, and this is why I say this is for the moon base folks. Radiation exposure is the number one limitation on exploration of our solar system. So they're identifying the same thing that was the issue in the 60s for the Star Trek crew. Studies on um, drug therapy are taking place, dietary supplements. People are looking for gene therapy tricks from radiation-resistant organisms to help astronauts who are on long missions beyond Earth, out of the Earth's magnetosphere, who will need, as NASA was quoted in the article, more than engineering playbook to be safe. They're going to need biology on their side. And yes, you're all pointing to the tardigrades. I want to say about something that's on the Artemis mission that was mentioned in this chapter that I thought was pretty cool. The photo on the right-hand lower part of the slide shows what's called an organ chip. And each crew member on the Artemis 2 mission has 2 organ chips that carries their bone marrow cells. One is going on the mission with them. It's actually going to be, I'm sorry, lower left-hand side. Yeah, they're actually going to be attached to the wall of the interior of the spacecraft where the astronauts are going to be housed. And one is going to stay on Earth. And when they come back, NASA's going to evaluate the 2 the 2 blood marrow samples, as well as blood samples taken before and after the voyage for signs of cellular stress and accelerated aging. That, yes, I agree, Sis, that is a cool experiment. And it leads to a second possibility of personalized medicine. Not only what happens to the astronauts in general, but what happens to specific astronauts, and it's good they have both men and women on this crew, to see how they differ in terms of their exposure. Now, it's a small sample, it's 4 people, but I think it's a great experiment. Now, in terms of having biology on their side, in addition, you've all identified the little tardigrade I showed down there. There's research going on in the use of what's called a damage-suppressing protein, a DSUP, that has been found in tardigrades. This protein was discovered in 2016 by Japanese scientists, and it's been shown to physically bind to DNA and shield it from damage. So it provides an actual biochemical shield for the DNA of tardigrades. Because people have wondered, how come the tardigrades have been around for millions of years and they haven't fallen prey to some of the problems that other organisms have fallen prey to? Well, one of the things they have are these damage-suppressing proteins that shield their DNA from damage. So people are experimenting with that, long way from doing anything for actual human beings, but it's in the works. The benediction in this article in Science was that on long missions and missions to the moon where people are going to live count as that. The quote is, radiation shifts from a passing threat to I'm sorry, radiation shifts from a passing threat to a chronic companion. So again, that's NASA's number one concern about the health of astronauts on long-term voyages. Okay, let's take a look at some applied science. We're going to take a look at the transfer of information by spies. In the original series, Journey to Babel by D.C. Fontana, famous Star Trek author, the crew of the Enterprise is taking delegates from all over the Federation to a big deal meeting. And Sarek of Vulcan is there. He's actually Spock's dad. There's Commander Kirk. There's Captain Kirk. There's an Andorian. So there are all sorts of aliens on board. They're not getting along well. It's a tough flight. And all of a sudden, the crew on the Enterprise notices that they're being tracked by an unknown vessel. It's an unidentified vessel. It's an unknown vessel. Nobody knows where it comes from. Starfleet says it shouldn't be in the area. They detect the fragment of a signal from an unknown source a fragment of a radio signal from an unknown source at the same time this unidentified vessel starts tracking the Enterprise. They honed in on this unknown source and find it's on the ship. The phone calls coming from the house, right? And one of the delegates, Telev, this is Telev, is shown to be the source of the signal. Telev is a surgically altered Andorian. He has a a transmitter implanted in one of his antennae. And that radio transmitter is what he's using to send signals about the Enterprise to that unknown ship. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in show. That's the science I want to talk about. But that's how the spies are communicating with their ship. Radio signals. As an aside, I have to mention this one, and this is for you, Tag. McCoy does some interesting surgery on Sarek of Vulcan. Sarek has a major heart issue while he's there. McCoy does open heart surgery on him, and he does a valve replacement operation. That had only been around for about 10 years. So McCoy's right up to date in what he's doing. And he need what's called a cardiopulmonary bypass system to do this, because something has to take over the circulation of blood in the patient while their heart is shut down and being monitored. And they have Spock hooked up as literally a living cardiopulmonary bypass system to assist Sarek during this surgery. Bottom line is, again, that's just an aside. That has nothing to do with the transfer of information by spies. But I wanted to point out that little additional feature of what goes on in this show. That's all I'm going to say about that one. They do shut down the radio transmission and everything works out fine, and they blow up the ship. The Next Generation has a really good show called The Drumhead that deals with a similar situation of the transfer of information by spies. This is Nora Satie. She's on board as a litigator who's actually running some trials against some people on the Enterprise. And what she's holding in her hand is an optical reader that is involved in the transfer of information by spies aboard the Enterprise. There's a Klingon exobiologist on board named Jadan. He's participating in a scientific exchange, but he's suspected of being involved in a breach of security. So Worf, who is on the left here, and Jadan is on the right, know each other, and Worf gains permission to explore Jadan's quarters. The situation is what I described. The warp drive of the Enterprise has been disabled in an accident. At the same time, plans for the dilithium chamber have appeared in the hands of the Romulans, who are the archenemy of the Federation. So the initial supposition is that those two events are linked. Mr. Worf found that small handheld device that I showed you on the previous slide in Jadan's chambers, his living quarters. Worf describes it. He says, this is Jadan's, a hyposyringe that he uses to treat his Balthazar syndrome, but this has been fitted with an optical reader specifically modified to read data from Starship isolinear chips. He can extract digital information from a computer, encode it in the form of amino acid sequences, and transform those sequences into a fluid in the syringe. He then injects someone, perhaps even without their knowledge. The information will be carried in their bloodstream in the form of inert proteins. The body itself becomes a conveyor of top-secret files. This device has but one function: to transfer computer information into biological sequences. And yes, you should watch some next-gen shows. These are good. And regarding the explosion in the dilithium chamber, look at what Data does. They made microtomographic analyses of the dilithium chamber. They did mass spectrometry readings of the residue for chemical contents. They're pretty well equipped to manage this whole thing. And look at what 30 years have brought us. In the Science of the Times, Journey to Babel, the plot device, transfer of information via a radio. It's powerful, but it's still a radio. In 1966, 1 year prior to that episode, the American Cryptogram Association published the following statement. Today, so much secret information is contained in coded radio messages that cryptanalysts can intercept more intelligence than secret agents can steal. Radios were all we had, and radios were good, and radios were used. And on the Enterprise, by darn, their spy used a radio. In the drumhead, the encoded message was transmitted in a protein. Now, in 1962, Francis Crick said, a protein is like a long sentence written in a language that has 20 letters. So he's presaging the use of a protein to encode things other than just biological information. 1990 in Forbes, they said in the 90s, the new technology theme is going to be codes, the creation and decryption of biochemical and electronic coding systems. And that's exactly what's going on in Star Trek. So how'd they do? Well, James Bond to the side, all we had in the 60s was a radio. And, going from coded transmissions sent by a radio and some guy's antenna to messages carried in vivo as a non-degradable protein is quite a leap. But that was a leap that also that was presaged in the science that went on in those intervening years on Earth. A major effort in drug design in the 90s was developing proteins that didn't trigger an immune response. And admittedly, the kind of protein that Worf discussing could not trigger an immune response. Now, an immune response. Now, how you're going to fish a single protein out of somebody's blood is a tough challenge, but we can allow, okay, they're going to make some advances in separation science as well. And in terms of the analysis of the dilithium chamber, both tomographic imaging as well as mass spectrometry analysis of residues from explosions were in the arsenal of forensic scientists in the 80s and 90s, as well as now. So I think both shows did pretty well as a mirror of their times, and the changes that have been wrought in the intervening 30 years are just incredible. Now, I want to do one thing as a final note that is a little different from the other three things I talked about. We're going to do a comparison of two members of the crews. We're going to compare Mr. Spock and Mr. Data. Spock, remember, was half Vulcan and half human. He embodied Vulcan logic. He suppressed emotion. He prioritized reason. He was really the logical outsider. Remember, he was the only alien on the bridge crew of the Enterprise. Mr. Data, he's the operations officer on the Enterprise G. He is an android. Data strives for nothing more than to become more human. He lacks emotions, but he desires them. And Data raises the overall question of what does it mean to be sentient? Let's take a look at this. Now, the first thing I want to share with you is a dialogue that Data and Spock had together. Those were two characters who actually met in a Next Generation episode called Unification. And listen to this discussion between Spock and Data. And remember, Spock is a humanoid, Data is an android. Spock, he intrigues me, this Picard, talking of Captain Picard. Data, in what manner, sir? Spock, remarkably analytical and dispassionate for a human. There's almost a Vulcan quality to the man. Data, interesting. I have not considered that. Captain Picard has been a role model in my quest to be more human. Spock says incredulously, more human? Data says, yes, Ambassador. Spock says, fascinating. You have an efficient intellect, superior physical skills, and no emotional impediments. There are Vulcans who aspire all their lives to achieve what you've been given by design. Data says, you are half human. Spock says, yes. Data says, yet you have chosen a Vulcan way of life. Spock says, I have. Data says, in effect, you have abandoned what I have sought all my life. Interesting discussion. So enter what I think is the best Star Trek episode going, The Measure of Man. The Next Generation, written by Melinda Snodgrass. I've seen crosstalk about the writers of these things. Melinda Snodgrass was an attorney, a practicing attorney, a litigator, and she quit because she wanted to write. And she is the author of this Next Generation episode. Here's the outline. The Enterprise visits Starbase 173 for routine maintenance. Commander Bruce Maddox, who's the guy in blue depicted in the picture here, comes aboard to see Data. He wants to disassemble Data to learn how to recreate the technology. Data refuses because he fears that factual details of his memory will be preserved, but the nuances will be lost. Maddox gets Starfleet to order Data to comply. Data resigns from Starfleet. Maddox argues that Data is Starfleet property, not sentient, and has no right to resign. Picard asks the judge adjutant general there, Philippa Lavoie, to overturn the ruling. She rules for Maddox. Picard requests a formal hearing, and the court process ensues. Oh, Delia, I think this is the best episode ever. I think this is really, really good. And again, remember, it was written by an attorney. Look at the upper picture. Picard, as senior commander, is charged to defend Data. Riker, as second in command, has to prosecute. Riker doesn't want to do it because he says Data's a friend. He can't do it. Lavoie, the JAG, says, you either do it or I'm going to rule in favor of Maddox, and this is done right now. So Riker is backed into a corner. He has to do it, and boy, does he do a good job. In this picture, you see Riker pulling off Data's arm, and he takes it over and shows the JAG officer, and because he's making the case that Data is a machine, and he says, look at this. He's composed of circuitry and wires and synthetic materials. And he apologizes to Data before he does this to him. Then this is Riker's final statement in saying that Maddox, that Data is property and that Maddox should be able to disassemble him. Riker says, the commander is a physical representation of a dream, an idea conceived by the mind of a man. Its purpose, to serve human needs. It is a connection of neural nets and heuristic algorithms. Its responses dictated by elaborate software written by a man. Its hardware built by a man. And now a man will shut it off. And he reaches around, and Data has an emergency turn-off switch that Riker found out about. Data keels over, absolutely lifeless, not moving. Riker sums up by just saying, Pinocchio is broken, its strings have been cut. It's devastating. Picard says, can we have a recess? The JAG officer says yes. Picard goes to talk with Guinan. Guinan, Whoopi Goldberg, runs Ted Forward, the bar, and is very much the conscience of the organization. Guinan said, think about what Maddox could do. He could create a whole army of Datas, all very valuable. He's proved his value to you, Picard says over and over again, more times than I count. He's a valuable member of the crew. Guinan goes on, and now he's about to be ruled the property of Starfleet. That should increase his value. Consider that in the history of the world, there have always been disposable creatures. They do their dirty work, the work that no one else wants to do because it's too difficult or too hazardous. And an army of Datas, all disposable. You don't have to think about their welfare, how they feel. A whole generation of disposable people. Picard says, you're talking about slavery. Guinan says, I think that's a little harsh. Picard says, I don't think that's a little harsh. It's the truth we have obscured behind a comfortable, easy euphemism. Property. But that's not the issue at all, is it? I mean, Picard understands that, and he realizes analog that Guinan is thinking, but we don't know what Picard is thinking and how he's going to go back. Listen to this. This is brilliant. Bingo, Delia. That's where we're going. Picard says, back into court, Commander Riker has demonstrated that Data is a machine, but that is not relevant. We're all machines, just machines of a different type. Data was created by a human. Again, not relevant. Children are created from the building blocks of their parents' DNA. Are they property? Maddox goes on and on about how that's baloney, and he says Data is not sentient. Picard asks him, would you enlighten us? What is required for sentience? Maddox hems and haws a bit, but then he says intelligence, self-awareness, consciousness. Picard challenges Maddox. He says, prove to the court that I am sentient. And Maddox goes through a few things, and Picard establishes that Data has two of Maddox's three criteria. Data is intelligent. Data is self-aware. In questioning Data, Data says, what is at issue is my right to choose, my rights. And Data says, Picard says, my, sounds pretty self-aware to me. Then Picard faces off against Maddox and says, now tell me, Commander, what is Data? Maddox says, I don't know. What is Data, Commander? I'm waiting for your answer. Maddox says, I don't know. Then Picard looks at Riker, points at him and says, do you? And he points at Lavoie. Do you? Well, that's the question you have to answer. And then, Picard closes with this. Your Honor, Starfleet was founded to seek out new life. Well, there it sits. And he points to Data. So Lavoie has to adjudicate this. She says, is Data a machine? Yes. Is he the property of Starfleet? No. We're all dancing around the basic issue. Does Data have a soul? I don't know if he has. I don't know that I have. But I have got to give him the freedom to explore himself. It is the ruling of this court that Lieutenant Commander Data has the freedom to choose. And everything, wow, this is an extraordinary episode. You have to admit that's a great exchange. And what I want to say is that was done in the late 80s, early 90s. Let's bring it right up to the future. The future issue of Scientific American, this is the February 2026 issue of Scientific American, cover story, The Hardest Problem, by Alison Parshall, who's one of their reporters. Here's the situation. Since the 90s, we've learned a lot, but researchers still can't agree on what consciousness is. We've built machines that can imitate it. Some models actually claim to be sentient. Philosophical traditions say that the mind or the soul, in terms of religious beliefs, is not made of physical stuff. That's called dualism. Science assumes the opposite, materialism. In 1998, a neuroscientist named Christopher Koch bet a philosopher, David Chalmers, a case of wine that a clear pattern of brain activation underlying consciousness would be discovered within 25 years. He lost the bet. We still don't have that, and that's what Scientific American is talking about. And if you go back to that dialogue, Maddox does not answer the question about what consciousness is and whether Data is conscious. He can't. And that's what the JAG officer refers to when she says soul. Does Data have a soul? I don't know if I have a soul. That's consciousness that they're talking about. And I'm sure, yes, he was, to say, is based on what I've read about this bet. But the bottom line is, that's an issue we're still talking about. It's incredibly pertinent. And that Star Trek story called The Measure of a Man, I think, is one of the absolute best. And it deals with an issue that we all have to admit is extraordinarily pertinent now. You can't, again, future issue of the New Yorker. It's sitting on my desk, but it's the February 1622 issue of the New Yorker. Has a story in it about Anthropic, the Anthropic company, and Claude and what they're doing with systems to make them more useful. Absolutely fascinating. Gets at the same issue. Bottom line is, I think Star Trek did a darn good job of discussing something that was a beginning issue back in the early 90s and is an extremely consuming issue right now. So if you watch only one show of The Next Generation, I really recommend The Measure of a Man. Well, that's a brief look at a couple things from The Next Generation and the original series. And we'll let the Enterprise warp back off into space and do its thing. And I will just now thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you all, and live long and prosper. Thank you all for listening. I really enjoyed putting this together. And as I say, live long and prosper. Have a good Valentine's Day. And thank you again for your attention. Glad you enjoyed it. Well, it's a lot of fun.